Thanks so much, Jim. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Davis, he, him, program co-director of Healthy Democracy. We are a Portland-based, but we work internationally, nonpartisan nonprofit that does innovative democracy stuff. And although we're not part of the coalition, we're thrilled whenever people are enthusiastic about what we do, and so delighted to be here. Thanks for having us. I'm going to talk about lottery-selected panels, or sometimes called policy juries, and the processes through which they can bring a new kind of civic participation into life. Let's start with the context first. This won't be surprising to anyone. We don't see ourselves in our democracy right now, and this is a huge problem. In terms of civic and political participation at the local level, we see huge disparities. This is just one disparity on income where there's a massive drop-off. But this exists for every disparity you can imagine, for every demographic you can imagine, with the biggest disparity of all being that the vast majority of Portlanders and folks in many other cities too, don't participate in policymaking at all. May vote, but that's about it. And we also don't see public decision-making as something that we can all do. We think this is either should be left to technical experts or to folks who have been elected. And that's partly because we exist when we do participate, we work within processes that assume a certain level of familiarity with an issue and assume a certain comfort with a very specific way of interacting when you think about it. They also undervalue lived experience, and they're often debate-oriented rather than collaboration-oriented. A third problem is that we don't see participation as influential. When we participate in processes, we don't have power over our own processes, and we really don't have power over the results of those processes and how they get into positions of influence, the connections to power, whether they be, that they're direct. No surprise, all of this has consequences, and we are seeing those consequences. People of my generation, born in the 80s, now less than a third of us think that it's essential, 10 out of 10, to live in a democracy. And that's not without reason. We look at our democracy and see that a whole lot of things aren't working, and we don't see ourselves there. So what can we do? Well, there are a lot of really cool ideas, and this is just one of them. There is no silver bullet, but I want to tell you about the one that we're really excited about and that we work on. First, though, imagine a democracy that's better. Imagine a democracy where our public decision-making reflects our diversity, where everyone participates in in-depth policymaking, where expertise is valued and questioned, where our government is a tool that we use together, not a thing that exists somewhere in the clouds. A little bit more context, actually. We like to break down a democracy into a democracy pie. And right now, we have a lot of two slices of the pie. We have processes that are open to anyone and processes where there are specific invitations to certain people. What we don't have is what we think is this third slice of pie, lottery selection. But actually, that's not a great metaphor, because what we don't need is to divide the current pie. We need more pie. And there's no reason why we shouldn't have more democracy pies. The first pie is still really important. It's open to anyone, but it's only open to anyone in theory. The downside is, in practice, that results in the same individuals, the same types of individuals participating, and a very thin kind of participation. We need that middle pie, special invitation, for getting stakeholders together, for doing outreach to particular communities, particularly marginalized communities. And it's great because it's targeted and specialized to a particular issue or impact. But it is often also the same individuals, often community leaders. And it therefore has sort of a top-down orientation often. Lottery selection, we feel like, fills in some of these gaps. It guarantees new and diverse folks in the room, and it is built around processes that have in-depth deliberation and that are panelist-led, not led by external forces like staff or consultants. But on the minus side, they do need time and lots of design work to make them work really well. Just a little bit more detail about what these processes look like. So who's in the room and how do they get there? A common method for bringing people into a lottery selected process is through an invitation mailer, a letter sent out to maybe 10,000 addresses across the city where anyone living at those addresses can respond, supplemented by golden tickets distributed to folks through social service agencies usually who don't live at a traditional residential address. But there are other selection methods too. Then when folks' responses are collected, demographic factors are decided on. These can be different things like are listed there. And the criteria is set for these different demographic factors proportionate to the population. More on that in a second. Then there's a selection event where those two things are combined, where a panel is selected from folks who respond, but it's still through a random process, but it represents all of those demographic targets. And here's sort of how that works, how that looks. This is a project run by the city of Eugene about a year ago. And just looking at the top line there on race and ethnicity, here's what the general population in Eugene looks like, about 2/3 white, 1/3 people of color. Here's who responds to the mailing. Vast overrepresentation of white people, no surprise there. And here's who was lottery selected. In this case, actually, there was a bit of an equity lens put on this demographic factor. The city wanted to use the K-12 population as sort of the reference point, which is something that you can do in any of these categories. Here are some typical demographic categories that are used: location of residence, race and ethnicity, age and gender, etc. And there are potentially any number of demographic factors that can be used. Again, this process is really unique because it guarantees representation. And again, there are a number of different ways to put an equity lens on any of these categories and over-select, not just what's proportional to the population. And this is what the result looks like. It's super exciting to see a cross-section of the community on a whole bunch of different demographics at the same time in one room all together. This is from the project in Eugene, a virtual room granted. Let's talk a little bit about what happens in the room, because that's different as well and equally revolutionary. So what starts out is that the group hears from a background experts and stakeholders on a variety of categories. Usually these are initially created or brought to the panel by a group of stakeholders on a particular issue or through some sort of pre-existing democratic process, even a separate lottery selected panel that's setting the agenda. Then panelists deliberate on the issue and produce recommendations. And this can happen many times over in loops with back and forth with decision makers, ideally, so that there is more of an assurance that those recommendations are being listened to. And I should mention that this kind of process is not necessarily just recommendations. It can be used for actual decision making as well. Just to sort of refresh on some of the core benefits of a lottery selected process, as I mentioned, the lottery itself brings in new voices and guarantees diversity on a whole bunch of different factors. These processes are also always matched with a stipend, a substantial stipend, a living wage, and all costs, child and elder care, and all the various expenses you can think of covered to make it as accessible as possible to folks who might not otherwise participate. Of course, that can be applied to many different kinds of processes. The process is also as self-governed as possible, and that is really, really important. That although there are folks like us that spend a lot of time thinking about how process works, it should really be up to the panel itself at the end of the day, what its own process looks like, and there should be systems so that it can exercise power over that. And certainly that its results, that its recommendations or decisions don't pass through anyone else before they get to decision makers. Also, it's important that folks on the panel, it's after all, everyday folks from straight off the street, have individual care and support, and that it's as comfortable an environment as possible. And that is also involved in how folks participate, multiple learning modes, et cetera. And that it values lived experience. No one needs special experience. We all know something about all the issues that we face as a city. There are quite a few benefits we think, to policymakers in new perspectives and untapped ideas and increased trust in governance. Also, though, a lot of benefits to existing stakeholders and advocates, like many of us in this room, that this allows for collaboration with and advocacy to a whole new body of individuals who are literally paid. It is their job to research deeply and understand all these diverse points of view. And that's something that we as advocates almost never get access to. It's obviously got a lot of benefits to the public as well in terms of ownership over public decision-making, collaboration, and increased access for historically marginalized groups. This model is not new. This is being used around the world in political situations that are often high stakes, contentious, complex, technical. It's sometimes being used temporarily. It's sometimes a permanent form of, part of the form of government. And it's being used on a gazillion different issues, from planning issues to environmental issues to civic engagement itself and how that's done, a sort of meta democracy, and all the way down the line. And its recommendations are powerful. Lottery selected deliberative processes generally, according to this study, which came out just a couple of years ago, the over 50% of recommendations, let's see, over 50%, well, how do I say that? The majority of recommendations in the majority of cases are adopted by decision makers. Just to end really fast on a quote from one of the panelists in Eugene in this project last year. He said, "You engaged us in the actual work of democracy, and that has left an imprint. I feel like this is community." And if I could just say one more thing before I close, it's that whatever other issues we all care about, and we all care about many other issues, they all depend on one thing: how we make decisions about those issues and who is involved. And if we don't fix that, we have a hard time fixing all the other things that we care about. Elections and council reform are a really important part of the puzzle, but they are only one slice of one democracy pie, and they don't fix some of these really core issues about participation and how we see ourselves in our democracy. We live in a city that is too big for all of us to be involved deeply in all of the decisions we face, but we should all have the chance to be involved deeply from time to time in the real meat of policymaking. Without that, we cannot rebuild our trust, or build rather our trust in democracy and in the decisions that come out of it. With that, I think I'm done. Thanks so much, and look forward to talking to you all.